The strike commander gripped the windscreen of the bridge as the USS Intrepid rolled through another swell, her massive hull cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of October 25, 1944. Somewhere beyond the horizon off Cape Engaño, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming south in what would prove to be the Imperial Navy's final gamble. The air smelled of salt spray and aviation fuel, punctuated by the acrid bite of coffee from the bridge crew's thermoses. Below on the flight deck, shadows moved with practiced precision. Yellow-shirted aircraft handlers guided F6F Hellcats and SB2C Helldivers into launch positions while red-shirted ordnance men made final adjustments to bombs and torpedoes. The organized chaos of a carrier preparing for combat was a symphony the strike commander had come to know intimately over 2 years of Pacific warfare. He pressed his binoculars to his eyes and scanned the darkness ahead. Intelligence reports suggested that Vice Admiral Ozawa's northern force was sailing directly into the teeth of Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet, 4 carriers, 2 hybrid battleship carriers, and escorts carrying fewer than 300 aircraft total. It was either supreme courage or calculated suicide. The numbers told the story of American naval supremacy. 18 aircraft carriers stretched across the horizon in Task Force 38, their collective air power representing over 1,500 carrier-based aircraft, 12 battleships, 24 cruisers, and 141 destroyers and escorts formed a steel wall that would have been unimaginable 3 years earlier when the Japanese had struck Pearl Harbor. The hunter had become the hunted. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, the Air Group 18 squadron leader, climbed to the bridge carrying a clipboard thick with mission orders. His weathered face bore the 1,000-yard stare of a pilot who had survived Midway, the eastern Solomons, and the Philippine Sea. He had flown against the best the Imperial Navy could offer and watched them slowly disappear beneath the waves. "Sir, we've got confirmation from reconnaissance," Hayes reported, his voice tight with anticipation. "Ozawa's carriers are approximately 150 miles northeast, steaming at 20 knots on a heading of 180. The Zuikaku is in the center. She's the prize. Last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force." The strike commander nodded, studying the tactical plot. The Zuikaku represented more than just another enemy ship. She was a symbol of Japanese naval power, a veteran of every major carrier engagement since Pearl Harbor. Her destruction would mark the end of an era, the final chapter in the story of Japanese carrier aviation. "What about their air cover?" he asked. Hayes consulted his notes. "Minimal. Our morning reconnaissance reports maybe 40 aircraft airborne, mostly Zeros and some dive bombers. Their combat air patrol looks thin, and there's no sign of coordinated defensive formations. Intelligence thinks most of their experienced pilots are already dead. The Pacific War had become a grinding war of attrition, and nowhere was this more evident than in Japanese naval aviation. The superbly trained pilots who had terrorized the Pacific in 1942 were gone, shot down over the Solomons, lost in the Marianas Turkey Shoot, or killed in desperate kamikaze attacks. Their replacements were young men with minimal training, flying obsolete aircraft against the most powerful naval force in history. As the eastern sky began to lighten, the strike commander made his way down to the flight deck. His F6F Hellcat waited on the forward elevator, her blue-gray camouflage paint weathered by months of Pacific combat. The maintenance crew had armed her with a single 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb and 8 .50-caliber machine guns loaded with 400 rounds per gun. She was a killing machine, designed by Grumman to outfight anything the Japanese could put in the air. Aviation machinist, Mate Second Class Rodriguez, completed his pre-flight inspection with the meticulous care of a man who understood that mechanical failure meant death. He had been maintaining Navy aircraft since before Pearl Harbor, and his skilled hands could detect problems that instruments might miss. "She's ready, sir," Rodriguez said, patting the Hellcat's engine cowling. "Oil pressure's good, all control surfaces check out, and the ordnance is hot. You bring my bird back, you hear?" The pilot nodded and began his own walk-around inspection. The Hellcat was a sturdy aircraft, built to absorb punishment and keep flying. Her Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine was one of the most reliable power plants in aviation, and her rugged construction had saved countless pilots from enemy fire. She wasn't as graceful as a Corsair or as fast as a Mustang, but she was dependable, and in carrier aviation, dependability meant everything. The ship's public address system crackled to life. Now hear this. All pilots, man your aircraft. First strike launches in 30 minutes. This is not a drill. Good hunting. 3 days earlier, the largest naval battle in history had begun with 2 submarine periscopes breaking the surface of the Palawan Passage. The USS Darter and USS Dace had intercepted Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force as it steamed toward Leyte Gulf, torpedoing the heavy cruisers Atigo and Maya and crippling the Takao. It was first blood in Operation Sho-Go, Japan's desperate attempt to destroy the American landing forces and turn the tide of the Pacific War. But the Japanese plan was more complex than a simple frontal assault. While Kurita's center force approached from the west with 9 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force was steaming up through the Surigao Strait. Meanwhile, Ozawa's northern force was deliberately exposing itself to American reconnaissance, hoping to draw Halsey's carriers away from the vulnerable landing beaches. Yesterday, October 24th, had seen the climax of the Sibuyan Sea engagement. Wave after wave of American carrier aircraft had pounded Kurita's battleships, concentrating their attack on the super battleship Musashi. The strike commander had participated in that assault, watching from his cockpit as the massive ship absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits before finally rolling over and disappearing beneath the waves. Over 1,000 Japanese sailors had gone down with her. The sight had been both magnificent and terrible. The Musashi was the pride of the Imperial Navy, a floating fortress armed with 9 1-inch guns and protected by armor up to 16 inches thick. She was supposed to be unsinkable, a symbol of Japanese engineering and naval power. But American aviation had proved that no ship, no matter how large or well-armored, could survive sustained air attack. Kurita had temporarily withdrawn after losing the Musashi, but intelligence suggested he was reforming and would resume his advance during the night. Meanwhile, Nishimura's southern force was approaching Surigao Strait, where Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet battleships waited in the classic T formation that had defined naval warfare since Trafalgar. But it was Ozawa's northern force that had captured Halsey's attention. The Japanese admiral was sailing his remaining carriers straight south, making no attempt at concealment. Reconnaissance aircraft had reported the Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda steaming in formation with minimal air cover. It was an opportunity that might not come again, the chance to destroy the last operational carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The strike commander climbed into his Hellcat's cockpit and began the familiar ritual of pre-flight checks. Fuel selector to main tank, mixture rich, propeller to low pitch, cowl flaps open. The instrument panel glowed with soft green radium paint, each gauge telling part of the story of a complex machine designed for war. The R2800 engine had 2,000 horsepower waiting to be unleashed, enough to push the Hellcat through the air at over 380 miles per hour. Around him, the flight deck came alive with purposeful activity. Plane captains removed chocks and tie-downs while flight deck crews prepared the steam catapults. The Intrepid was turning into the wind, her speed increasing to provide maximum wind over deck for the launching aircraft. Other carriers in the task force were making similar preparations: Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and 15 others, each one a floating airfield capably of projecting American power across hundreds of miles of ocean. The radio crackled with the voice of the air group commander. All Hellcat pilots, this is strike leader. Weather over target is clear with unlimited visibility. Enemy force consists of 4 carriers in loose formation, speed 20 knots, heading south. Expect moderate to heavy anti-aircraft fire and limited fighter opposition. Primary targets are the carriers. Secondary targets are screening vessels. Remember, gentlemen, this is the end of Japanese carrier aviation. Let's make it count. The strike commander felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. Somewhere ahead in the gray dawn lay the Zuikaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, the eastern Sol Mons, and the Philippine Sea. She had dodged American bombs and torpedoes for nearly 3 years, but her luck was about to run out. Today, October 25, 1944, would see the final destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force. The catapult officer raised his checkered flag as steam pressure built in the launching gear. The strike commander advanced his throttle to full power, feeling 2,000 horses strain against the holdback fitting. The Hellcat's engine roared with barely contained fury, her propeller clawing at the salt air. Behind him, the bomb's weight pressed against the aircraft's centerline, 1,000 pounds of high explosive that would soon find its mark on a Japanese flight deck. Launch the ready deck. The order echoed across the flight deck as the catapult officer dropped his flag. The world exploded into motion. The steam catapult hurled the Hellcat forward with tremendous force, pressing the pilot deep into his seat as the aircraft accelerated from 0 to flying speed in less than 3 seconds. The deck fell away beneath him as the Hellcat climbed into the morning sky, her engine settling into the steady rhythm of cruise power. Behind him, the Intrepid continued launching aircraft with mechanical precision. Every 30 seconds, another fighter or bomber roared off the deck, joining the growing formation that was assembling above the task force. F6F Hellcats carrying bombs and rockets, SB2C Helldivers with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs, TBM Avengers armed with torpedoes, each aircraft representing months of training and millions of dollars in American industrial might. The strike commander joined the circling formation as the sun broke free of the horizon, painting the sky in shade-soft gold and crimson. Below, the Third Fleet spread across the ocean like a chess set made of steel, carriers in the center protected by rings of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. It was the most powerful naval force ever assembled, the product of American shipyards working around the clock since Pearl Harbor. "Strike Group Alpha, this is Strike Leader," the radio crackled. "Form up on me. We have 180 aircraft launching from 6 carriers. Target bearing 045, range 150 miles. Time to target 45 minutes. The formation took shape with practiced efficiency. Hellcats formed the outer perimeter, their job to sweep away any Japanese fighters that might interfere with the attack. Inside the fighter screen, the dive bombers and torpedo planes settled into their approach formations, each pilot mentally rehearsing the attack run that lay ahead. As they climbed to 15,000 feet, the strike commander could see the scale of what Halsey had unleashed. Other strike groups were launching from carriers across the task force, the Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and Ticonderoga, each contributing their own formations to the aerial armada. In total, over 400 aircraft would participate in the morning's attack, more than the entire Japanese carrier force possessed. The flight north took them over empty ocean, the blue-green waters of the Philippine Sea stretching endlessly in all directions. The strike commander used the time to review his attack plan. As the leader of the fighter sweep, his job was to clear the skies of Japanese defenders and then provide cover for the bombers as they made their runs. If enemy fighters appeared, he would engage them. If they didn't, he would strafe the carrier's anti-aircraft guns to suppress defensive fire. Radio chatter was minimal during the approach. The pilots had learned the hard way that the Japanese often monitored American frequencies, and operational security was paramount. Instead, they communicated through hand signals and formation changes, the silent language of naval aviation that had been perfected through months of combat operations. At 15,000 feet, the air was thin and cold despite the tropical latitude. The strike commander could see his breath fogging inside his oxygen mask as he scanned the sky for enemy aircraft. The Hellcat's engine ran smoothly, her instruments showing normal readings across the board. Fuel was sufficient for the mission with a comfortable reserve, ammunition was full, and the bomb release mechanism had tested properly during the pre-flight check. Tally-ho! Enemy surface vessels, bearing 040, range 20 miles. The call came from a reconnaissance Hellcat flying ahead of the main formation. The strike commander felt his pulse quicken as he strained his eyes toward the horizon. There, barely visible as dark specks against the morning glare, lay Ozawa's northern force. Through his binoculars, the strike commander could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese warships spread across several miles of ocean. The Zuikaku was immediately recognizable, a large fleet carrier with her characteristic island superstructure and long flight deck. The light carriers Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda formed a loose formation around her, their smaller profiles still unmistakably hostile. What struck him most was how few aircraft were visible above the enemy formation. A handful of Zeros circled at various altitudes, their pilots probably straining their eyes upward, trying to count the approaching American aircraft. It was a futile gesture. The Japanese combat air patrol was hopelessly outnumbered, facing odds of nearly 10-1. "Strike leader to all aircraft," the radio crackled. "Target in sight. Hellcats, clear the sky. Dive bombers, set up your runs on the carriers. Torpedo planes, come in low from the southeast. Execute." The formation broke apart as each aircraft type maneuvered to its assigned role. The strike commander pushed his Hellcat into a shallow dive, building speed as he searched for enemy fighters. His wingman, a young pilot from Nebraska flying his first major strike, stayed glued to his right wing with textbook precision. The first Japanese fighter appeared at 2 o'clock high, a lone Zero diving toward the American formation with obvious desperation. The strike commander rolled his Hellcat and pulled into a climbing turn, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. The Zero pilot was aggressive but inexperienced, trying to turn fight with a Hellcat instead of using his aircraft's superior maneuverability in hit-and-run attacks. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds. The strike commander lined up his gunsight pipper on the Zero's engine cowling and squeezed the trigger. 8 .50 caliber machine guns erupted in a devastating chorus, their combined firepower capable of sawing a fighter aircraft in half. The Zero shuddered under the impact, white smoke trailing from her engine before rolling over and diving toward the ocean in her final plunge. "Splash 10, he reported tersely, already scanning for the next threat. But there were precious few threats to find. The Japanese had fewer than 40 aircraft airborne, and most of those were obsolete types flown by pilots with minimal training. The Imperial Navy's elite aviators, the men who had struck Pearl Harbor and terrorized the Pacific for 18 months, were gone, casualties of a war of attrition they could not win. Below, the American attack was developing with lethal precision. SB2C Helldivers were rolling into their dives from 12,000 feet, their pilots aiming for the carrier's vulnerable flight decks. The Helldiver was an ugly aircraft. Pilots called it the Beast, but it could carry a 1,000-pound bomb with devastating accuracy. The first bombs began exploding among the Japanese ships, great geysers of water and smoke marking near misses, while direct hits sent sheets of flame racing across flight decks. The Chitose was the first to die. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck her flight deck in rapid succession, the explosions tearing through her thin armor and igniting aviation fuel stored below. Within minutes, she was dead in the water, her superstructure wreathed in black smoke and orange flame. Her crew fought desperately to control the fires, but the damage was too extensive. She would not see another sunrise. The strike commander watched the attack unfold from 8,000 feet, marveling at the clinical efficiency of American naval aviation. TBM Avengers were coming in low from the southeast, their pilots threading their way through intense anti-aircraft fire to launch their torpedoes at point-blank range. The Mark 13 torpedoes had finally been debugged after years of problems, and they were running true and exploding properly. The Zuiho took 2 torpedo hits on her starboard side, the underwater explosions buckling her hull plates and flooding her engine rooms. She began to list immediately, her speed falling off as her engineering crews fought to maintain power. A follow-up attack by dive bomber sealed her fate. 3 more bombs struck her flight deck, and she began settling by the stern. "This is strike leader," the radio announced. "Excellent work, gentlemen. Reform and prepare for second attack. We're not finished here." The second wave arrived from the southwest like an avenging angel, 180 aircraft from the carriers ESX, Lexington, and Franklin. The strike commander watched from his perch above the battle as fresh squadrons of dive bombers and torpedo planes maneuvered for their attack runs. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was becoming more sporadic as gun crews were killed or wounded, but it remained deadly for any pilot who flew straight and level for too long. The Zuikaku had become the focus of American attention. As the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force, she represented everything the U.S. Navy had been fighting to destroy since December 7, 1941. Her flight deck was already scarred by bomb hits from the first attack, but she was still steaming at 18 knots, her damage control parties working frantically to keep her operational. The strike commander watched as a division of Helldivers from the ESX rolled into their attack. The lead pilot, a veteran dive bomber commander, held his aircraft in its screaming plunge until he was below 2,000 feet before releasing his bomb. The 1,000-pound armor-piercing weapon struck the Zuikaku's flight deck just aft of her island superstructure, the explosion tearing through 3 decks before detonating in her hangar spaces. Secondary explosions followed as aviation fuel and ammunition cooked off in the intense heat. The Zuikaku's hangar deck became an inferno, fed by fuel lines that her damage control parties couldn't isolate quickly enough. Smoke poured from her superstructure's internal bulkheads, buckled under the heat and pressure of the fires. But the veteran carrier absorbed the punishment and kept fighting. Her anti-aircraft guns continued firing even as flames licked at their positions, and her engineering crews maintained power to her propellers. The Zuikaku had survived this long by being tough, and she would not die easily. The TBM Avengers came next, their approach coordinated with the precision of a ballet. 6 torpedo bombers from Air Group 19 split into 2 sections, attacking from opposite sides to divide the Japanese defensive fire. The lead pilot flew his Avenger straight through a wall of anti-aircraft fire, tracer rounds streaming past his cockpit like deadly fireworks. The torpedo launch came at 800 yards range, close enough to see the frightened faces of Japanese sailors on the carrier's deck. The Mark 13 torpedo dropped into the water and ran straight and true, its warhead armed and ready. The explosion came below the Zuikaku's waterline on her port side, the underwater blast lifting her massive hull visibly out of the water before settling back with a tremendous splash. The strike commander watched as the great carrier began to develop a list to port. Her speed dropped to 12 knots, then 8, as flooding overwhelmed her damage control efforts. The torpedo had ruptured her port aviation fuel tanks, and the volatile gasoline was feeding the fires that were now raging throughout her hull. A third attack wave appeared on the horizon, aircraft from the Ticonderoga and Langley arriving right on schedule. The Japanese had managed to get perhaps 20 fighters airborne, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and fighting for their lives against superior American aircraft flown by experienced pilots. The strike commander dove on a Zero that was making a desperate attack on a damaged Helldiver. The Japanese pilot was skilled but flying an obsolete aircraft against a technically superior opponent. The engagement was brief and decisive. A 2-second burst from the Hellcat's guns sent the Zero spiraling into the ocean, its pilot either dead or unconscious. "Strike leader to all aircraft," the radio announced. "Japanese carriers are breaking formation. Continue the attack." From his vantage point at tens of their feet, the strike commander could see the entire northern force spread out like a tactical map below. The Chitose was already gone, her hull disappearing beneath the waves with a final hiss of steam. The Zuiho was listing heavily to starboard, her flight deck awash and her crew abandoning ship. Only the Zuikaku and Chiyoda remained operational, but both carriers were clearly doomed. The Zuikaku was the main prize, and American pilots pressed their attacks with relentless determination. She had been struck by at least 6 bombs and 4 torpedoes, but her veteran crew kept her fighting. Damage control parties worked with heroic dedication, shoring up bulkheads and fighting fires, even as the ship listed further to port with each passing minute. The strike commander watched a division of SB2C Helldivers from the Franklin begin their attack run. The lead pilot held his dive angle steep and true, ignoring the intense anti-aircraft fire that filled the air around his aircraft. At 1,500 feet, he released his 1,000-pound bomb and pulled out in a crushing climb that stressed his airframe to its limits. The bomb struck the Zuikaku's forward elevator, the explosion sending the massive platform spinning through the air like a discus. The blast tore a hole in the flight deck large enough to drive a truck through, and more secondary explosions followed as the fire reached ammunition storage areas. The great carrier shuddered under the impact, her hull plates groaning as structural damage accumulated beyond any hope of repair. But it was the torpedo attack that delivered the death blow. 8 TBM Avengers from the Lexington approached from 4 different directions, their pilots coordinating their runs to overwhelm the Japanese defensive fire. The Zuikaku's anti-aircraft guns engaged frantically, filling the sky with explosive shells and tracer rounds, but they couldn't stop all 8 aircraft. 4 torpedoes found their mark, striking the carrier's starboard side in a devastating bracket. The underwater explosions ruptured her hull below the waterline, flooding her engine rooms and knocking out her electrical power. The Zuikaku's list increased dramatically as thousands of tons of seawater poured into her hull through the torpedo holes. The strike commander circled the dying carrier at 5,000 feet, watching as her crew prepared to abandon ship. Sailors were throwing life rafts over the side and helping wounded shipmates toward the lifelines. There was no panic. These were professionals who had trained for this moment, even though they had never expected it to come. The Zuikaku rolled for the port, her flight deck now canted at a 30-degree angle. Aircraft that had been spotted for launch slid across the deck and tumbled into the ocean, their aluminum frames crumpling as they struck the water. The carrier's island superstructure disappeared beneath the waves as she continued her roll, taking with her the battle flags and radio equipment that had coordinated Japanese naval aviation for 3 years of war. "There she goes," his wingman reported quietly over the radio. The Zuikaku completed her death roll and slipped beneath the surface stern first, her propellers still turning as she disappeared. A massive air bubble erupted from her hull as the ocean claimed the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force. With her went the dreams of Japanese naval supremacy and the expertise of a generation of carrier aviators. The Chiyoda was fighting for her life 2 miles to the southeast, but her fate was already sealed. The light carrier had taken multiple bomb hits and was listing badly. Her flight deck split open like a broken eggshell. American aircraft continued to attack her with methodical precision, each bomb and torpedo bringing her closer to the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The strike commander led his division in a strafing attack on the carrier's anti-aircraft positions. At 2,000 feet, he could see Japanese sailors manning their guns with desperate courage, continuing to fire even as their ship died around them. His 50-caliber machine guns raked the carrier's superstructure, the heavy bullets punching through steel plate and silencing gun positions one by one. The attack was not without cost. A young pilot from the Franklin, flying his 3rd combat mission, took a direct hit from a Japanese 5-inch gun while making his bombing run. His Helldiver exploded in midair, the fireball visible from miles as aviation fuel ignited. There would be no parachute, no rescue, just another name on the casualty list that were growing longer with each day of the Pacific War. But for every American aircraft lost, the Japanese were paying a price they could not afford. Their remaining fighters were being systematically destroyed by superior American aircraft flown by experienced pilots. A Zero that tried to intercept a formation of torpedo planes was jumped by 4 Hellcats and shot to pieces in seconds. Another Japanese pilot, probably no more than 19 years old, made a desperate ramming attack on a dive bomber and succeeded only in destroying his own aircraft while the American plane continued to its target. The Chiyoda took her final hit from a torpedo launched by an Avenger from the Intrepid. The Mark 13 struck her just below the waterline amidships, the explosion breaking her back and sealing her doom. She began settling rapidly by the stern, her crew abandoning ship as water poured through the massive hole in her hull. "Strike leader to all aircraft," the radio announced. "Primary targets are neutralized. Secondary targets include cruisers and destroyers. Continue the attack." The strike commander looked down at the carnage below. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were gone or going down. Only the light carrier Zuiho remained afloat, but she was clearly finished, dead in the water with her flight deck awash and fires burning throughout her superstructure. Japanese destroyers were picking up survivors from the water, but they would soon become targets themselves. The destruction of Ozawa's northern force was systematic and merciless. American aircraft attacked in coordinated waves, each strike group timing its approach to maximize damage while minimizing losses to anti-aircraft fire. The Japanese had no effective defense against such overwhelming air power. Their few remaining fighters were quickly shot down, and their anti-aircraft guns were silenced by repeated strafing attacks. The strike commander watched as the light cruiser took multiple bomb hits and began settling by the bow. Her crew fought gallantly to save their ship, but the flooding was too extensive. Within an hour, she would join the carriers on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The destroyer Akatsuki met a similar fate when a dive bomber from the ESX scored a direct hit on her forward magazine. The explosion broke her in half, and she sank in less than 2 minutes. But it was the final destruction of the Zuikaku that provided the most dramatic moment of the battle. The light carrier had been burning for over an hour, her crew fighting desperately to control the fires that were consuming her from within. American pilots had left her alone, assuming she was finished, but her damage control parties had managed to restore partial power and were attempting to make way. A final strike group from the Lexington appeared on the scene just as the Zuikaku's crew thought they might save their ship. 6 TBM Avengers approached from the west, their pilots determined to finish what earlier attacks had started. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and poorly aimed. Most of the gun crews were dead or wounded, and those who remained were fighting fires as much as enemy aircraft. The torpedo attack was textbook perfect. All 6 Avengers launched their Mark 13s in a coordinated spread, the torpedoes entering water in a precise pattern that gave the Zuikaku no chance to evade. 4 torpedoes struck her hull below the waterline, the explosions rupturing her hull plates and flooding her machinery spaces. The light carrier's death throes were agonizing to watch. She rolled slowly to starboard as water poured through the torpedo holes, her flight deck disappearing beneath the waves inch by inch. Her crew had fought bravely, but courage could not overcome the laws of physics. Within 15 minutes, the Zuikaku was gone, taking with her the last operational aircraft of Ozawa's force. The strike commander circled Theria where the 4 carriers had died, noting the oil slicks and debris fields that marked their final resting places. Life rafts dotted the water, filled with Japanese survivors who would spend hours or days waiting for rescue that might never come. It was the price of war, young men dying far from home in service to causes they might not fully understand. All aircraft, this is strike leader, the radio announced. Mission accomplished. Form up for return to base. Outstanding work, gentlemen. The flight back to the task force was subdued, marked by the quiet satisfaction of a job well done and the sobering knowledge of what they had witnessed. 4 aircraft carriers, the backbone of Japanese naval aviation, had been destroyed in less than 4 hours of sustained attack. With them had died not just ships and aircraft, but the institutional knowledge and experience that had made the Imperial Navy a feared opponent in the early years of the war. The strike commander's Hellcat had performed flawlessly throughout the mission, her rugged construction and reliable engine bringing him safely through another day of combat. His ammunition counter showed he had fired less than 200 rounds. The Japanese air opposition had been so light that most American fighters never had a chance to engage. It was a stark contrast to the desperate battles of 1942 and 1943, when every encounter with Japanese fighters had been a life-or-death struggle. As the American formation approached the Third Fleet, the strike commander could see that other operations were continuing across the vast expanse of the Philippine Sea. Radio reports indicated that Admiral Kinkaid's 7th Fleet had annihilated Admiral Nishimura's southern force during the night in Surigao Strait, crossing the T in classic fashion and destroying both Japanese battleships. Meanwhile, off Samar, the small escort carriers of Taffy III were fighting for their lives against Admiral Kurita's center force in one of the most desperate actions of the Pacific War. But here, off Cape Engaño, the battle was over. Ozawa's sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose, drawing Halsey's carriers away from Leyte Gulf, but at a cost the Imperial Navy could not afford. 4 fleet and light carriers, along with their escorts, represented a significant portion of Japan's remaining naval strength. Their destruction left the Imperial Navy with virtually no carrier aviation capability and marked the effective end of Japanese naval air power. The landing aboard the Intrepid was routine, a perfect three-wire trap that brought the Hellcat to a halt in less than 200 feet. The deck crew quickly moved the aircraft out of the landing area as other planes began their approaches. Within an hour, all surviving aircraft from the strike had been recovered, their pilots debriefed, and their aircraft rearmed for potential follow-up missions. In the ready room, the atmosphere was quietly celebratory. Pilots compared notes on their attacks, confirming damage to specific targets and accounting for Japanese aircraft destroyed. The intelligence officers would compile detailed reports, but the basic facts were clear. Ozawa's northern force had been eliminated as an effective fighting unit. Lieutenant Commander Hayes called for attention as he entered the ready room carrying updated intelligence reports. His face showed both satisfaction and concern, satisfaction at the day's success, but concern for what was happening elsewhere in the vast battle area. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we've sunk 4 Japanese carriers today, along with several cruisers and destroyers. It's a significant victory, but the battle is far from over. Admiral Kurita's center force has engaged our escort carriers off Samar, and the situation there is fluid. We may be called upon for additional strikes before this day is over." As reports filtered in from across the battle area, the full scope of the Battle of Leyte Gulf began to emerge. In Surigao Strait, Admiral Oldendorf's battleships had executed a perfect crossing of the T, destroying Admiral Nishimura's southern force in a classic naval engagement that would have been familiar to Nelson or Farragut. The battleships Fuso and Yamashiro had been sunk along with most of their escorts, and Admiral Nishimura himself was dead. Off Samar, the situation was more complex and dangerous. Admiral Kurita's center force, led by the super battleship Yamato, had surprised the escort carriers of Taffy 3 in what should have been a one-sided massacre. But the small American ships had fought with such ferocity and skill that Kurita had withdrawn, believing he was facing a much larger force. The escort carrier Gambier Bay had been sunk, along with several destroyers and destroyer escorts, but the landing forces at Leyte remained secure.